Secretary Lloyd Austin revoked the plea deals in August, arguing the responsibility for such a significant decision should rest with him. On Wednesday, the judge ruled Austin acted too late and that the deals were valid. The prosecution requested the pause in court proceedings to appeal that decision. A defense official says a new date will be determined in December or
has weakened our energy security and made us overly dependent on nations like China, the world's largest polluter. China is responsible for almost 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than the entire developed world combined. And we cannot allow our energy future to be dictated by those who do not share our values.
Kluger went on to say global energy demand is expected to double by 2050. He added the race to supply that demand shouldn't be lost to those who don't share the same values as the United States. Republican Congressman John James said that energy security is national security and that American energy independence strengthens America's allies.
It won't hold any value for the U.S. It'll be just the opposite. It's bad optics for the U.S. It's great optics for China, but I don't see, barring any other special arrangement between Biden and Xi Jinping, there's no real benefit for Biden showing up.
So you just said it would be the opposite. Tell me more about that, and what do you think this last meeting between Xi and Biden is really about then?
Well, I think from Biden's perspective, it's a legacy play, at least. He wants to have one last shot at on the world stage and looking presidential and so forth. But the optics are bad for the U.S. because look at the comparison. China has just provided funding for a $1.3 billion port for Peru. The audience is not just Peru, but all of South America and certainly China. It bolsters Xi's image in China and the rest of the world. And what's the rest of the world seeing? Well, they're seeing an engaged China in South America, and they're seeing a weak, ineffective, and losing president with minimal cognitive abilities leading him. It's bad optics. It's not there's nothing gained here from the U.S. Perspective in terms of legacy, influence, and so forth.
That's interesting. So tell me more about what do you think Chinese leader Xi's message or last minute message here would be to the U.S., to President Biden?
I think the message isn't to the U.S. as much, given that Biden has about 60 days or so. The message is to the rest of the world and to the region. China is a big player now in Peru and in South America, has been and continues to be. So China is flexing its muscle as a geopolitical and economic influencer in South America and in Peru specifically, versus a ineffectual president who's leaving office. The contrast couldn't be clearer.
Now tell me a bit more about the China-U.S. relationship in this administration. Because on the one hand, we hear a lot about the China threat, but on the other hand, we are seeing the U.S. turning to China for help here and there. And most recently would be the example of asking to curb North Korean troops in Russia. What do you think the U.S. wants from China in terms of this balance? And will this change with the new administration when Trump comes in?
It certainly is bad form to be, on the one hand, critical of policies and adversarial trade, and on the other hand, making your security and that of your allies weaker, which has happened under Biden as our military and navies have shrunk, and our presence in the region, in the Pacific region, have shrunk, and our capabilities there have shrunk. So on the one hand, to be reliant on China's diplomatic good graces to act as a counterbalance to the North Koreans being in Russia, that's a position of weakness. To have to ask them to, they should be deterred from doing that. We shouldn't be asking them to do that. So it shows kind of that relationship is unequal, and it shows the U.S. in a position of asking versus China considering what the U.S. would do if they approved and allowed North Korea to participate in the war in Ukraine, which is what's happening. So it shows an imbalance in the relationship and not in the U.S.'s favor.
Interesting. I think, Trump is probably wanting to change that, and Beijing is probably looking at Trump's appointment with all these, Beijing hawks. Do you think Beijing is preparing for a Trump presidency, and how?
Well, they're certainly preparing for it. How they're preparing for it is, it looks like they're really driving a lot of their economic activity in terms of resources and markets. That Peru's a perfect example of that, of expanding their footprint and their influence and their economic power. They certainly want to inoculate themselves from the tariffs and other economic punishments that are likely to come from the Trump administration. So that's their main goal, is to immunize themselves as much as possible from more hawkish Trump position on China.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for your time this evening, James Gorey. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Now, staying with China after.
I think he went to apologize for Trump getting elected.
I truly believe
that's what I
cooperation of
believe.
Our countries will be the foundation to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific.
Leader attending a ribbon-cutting ceremony abroad. We know that Peru is the recipient of the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative. Talk to us about the strategy behind this so-called infrastructure project.
The strategy is simple. We give you money, we give you investment, we dominate your economy, and then we expect military benefits. This is the Chinese strategy. It's working around the world. It's working in Africa. It's working in Cambodia. It's working in Sri Lanka. And Xi Jinping expects that it will be working in Latin America, Peru, for starters, perhaps Argentina later, perhaps Brazil sooner than that.
Richard, for maybe some audience members, we talk about it a lot on our network, but they maybe aren't familiar with the term unrestricted warfare. Is it fair to say that these types of projects would fall into that category? And geopolitically, why is China seeking to expand its influence in Peru and more broadly across Latin America?
Well, what Xi Jinping is doing in Latin America this week falls under the category more of traditional power competition. If China does secure military footholds in Peru or Argentina or Brazil, then yes, what is termed unrestricted warfare will come more into play. Use of cyber warfare, infiltration, setting up nodes for potential future terrorist attacks. All of that could come into play. And these are the dangers that America faces in Latin America. Peru has had China as its largest trading partner for the last decade. China is the second largest investor. The United States does not have any $1 to $3 billion ports to point to highlight its long-standing influence in the region.
Richard, former Ambassador Carla Sands to Denmark, U.S. Ambassador, she sounded the alarm during her tenure there, where the ports there were actually using Chinese surveillance equipment. So do we run the risk of certain espionage activities coming in and out of these ports? And how hard will it be for the U.S. to counter this influence once the project is complete? And what can we ultimately do to protect our own interests and security?
Well, unfortunately, the United States has been bereft in terms of strategy. We've been reactive. We have not built up our own influence in the region to counter the arrival of China's influence. We had a lucky break in the recent election in Argentina of a capitalist free market president who immediately bought American fighter jets after China had been trying to sell Argentina fighter jets for the last decade and a half. But for the United States, we're very quickly moving into a position where we're going to need a much larger Coast Guard and a much larger Navy to counter direct Chinese military use and eventually a presence in our own hemisphere.
Richard Fisher, Senior Fellow of Asian Military Affairs at the International Assessment and Strategy Center. Thank you for your insight.
Thank you.